Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Strategic International Studies. I'm Andrew Schwartz, Senior Vice President here at CSIS, and it's my honor to host James Kitfield, and we're doing this in partnership with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. We were just talking upstairs. One of the really wonderful things about the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress and CSIS is they were both founded by the late David Absher. And for those of you who knew Doc Absher, he was a remarkable, remarkable man who we all loved. And you know, he lived to see this building, which was really terrific because you know, he started CSIS over 50 years ago with Admiral Arleigh Burke. And for years we were you know, at 18th and K and less opulent surroundings, to say the least.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah, we would have been doing this book talk in a basement with no windows, and you know, we would never have gotten here though without David Absher. So it's an honor to be working with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and of course to have my friend James Kitfield here, who has written another remarkable book. I don't have to read you his bio. You all know it. He's one of the best military reporters to ever work in this town. He's one of the best authors. He has the respect of the people that he interviews and writes about, and the respect of his readers, and the respect of fellow journalists.
Thanks for saying that.
And certainly of the policy community, who consider him to be someone of, just impeccable talent and character, and we've all learned quite a lot from James Kitfield over the years. The book is terrific, and I know that all of you, the holidays are coming up, so don't buy one, buy two. For those of you at home who are watching on the webcast or on C-SPAN, they're available on Amazon, they're available wherever they sell books. It's a marvelous book, and I strongly recommend it. Everyone at CSIS will get through it by the end of the year. I have no doubt of that. Thank you for coming out on another calm evening in Washington. Nothing much going on here. It's all quiet. But the sun was shining today, and the sun is always shining on us over here at CSIS. We're a bipartisan institution that aims to be constructive on policy, and that's what we hope to talk about tonight. We hope to learn from James's book, and we hope to take your questions. So get your questions in mind. We're gonna get to them in just a few minutes. But James, why don't you tell us at the beginning, why the name of the book, and what was the origin of the book?
Well, I picked Twilight Warriors because I was looking for something that conveyed the fact that this conflict we're in, this conflict, sort of a global terrorist movement, it's neither night or day, it's neither victory or defeat, it's neither war or criminality, it's a hybrid of it, and it's kind of this idea of a sort of perpetual conflict. So that's how I picked the name. The genesis of it was really, I was doing a lot of reporting around 2011, which I thought was really a watershed year for the sort of post 9/11 war on terror, if you will. Obama came into the office. In the first 2 years, he launched more drone strikes against terrorists, targeting terrorists in Pakistan than the Bush administration had done in 8 years. The Joint Special Operations Command had tripled the number of, in just a couple of years, the number of strikes that it had launched each month. In a space of a year, 2010, 2011, we killed more than half of the top 20 al-Qaeda lieutenants, senior level leaders. And in that year, we also killed the two most wanted terrorists in the world, Osama bin Laden and Anwar al-Awlaki, who was the head of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So clearly something was happening. We had reached a level of effectiveness I had never seen in my coverage. I covered everything, that happened after 9/11, including the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So something was going on. And same year, not by coincidence, President Obama decides to pull all our troops out of Iraq. He ran the next year as the president who killed Osama bin Laden, the commander-in-chief who killed Osama bin Laden, and ended the post 9/11 wars was keeping to a deadline to get out of Afghanistan by 2014. So clearly we were, and then he gave a speech in his second term in 2013 where he basically tried to define the war on terror as being over, and that we had so decimated al-Qaeda that we could now sort of put it into a more normal threat level and get on with, widen the aperture of American foreign policy. All very laudable goals. So it seemed to me that there was something going on, that we were going to trust this new kind of targeted terrorist killings as being our main strategy against the war on terror, and that we could do that. And that struck me as interesting on two fronts. One of which is we didn't know very much about this target and killing program. It was cloaked in almost total secrecy. They, if you'll remember, as recently as a few years ago, would even deny, or not deny, but fail to acknowledge that they were actually behind these drone strikes that people were seeing.
And there were no leaks.
There were very few leaks, and so we were relying on this sort of new style of operations that we knew almost nothing about. So as a journalist, that really intrigued me. And I also, because of my reporting, knew that this idea that al-Qaeda was done and that we could sort of downgrade it to sort of a normal sort of threat was not shared by a lot of the top intelligence guys and the top guys who actually did the targeted killing program. They had killed a lot of leaders. The groups persisted. And so for those two reasons, it seemed to me it was worth a real deep dive to understand this method of operation that was being so successful, but also understand the enemy and understand, whether these wars were really over.
How did we get so successful?
It turns out that, and you mentioned prodigal soldiers, which we looked at the force that fought in the Persian Gulf War that was so effective. And we were still in sort of the post-Vietnam sort of malaise about the military being not very effective. And if you remember, the key to that was Goldwater Nichols, where they basically forced the services to stop this internecine competition between each other and to be joint. And that was a key part of the military becoming more effective. Well, it turns out that what Joint Special Operations Command's task forces, multi-agency task forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, were almost perfect crucibles for forging a synergistic model of operations that combined a skill set of intelligence agencies, joint special operations, direct action units, law enforcement agencies like the FBI and the DEA and others. And they all operated under one roof in a wartime environment and sometimes very desperate circumstances, and they broke down all the barriers and really came up with an operational style whose sum was much better than whose whole was much better than the sum of its parts.
But the record number of targets that they hit, did that surprise you?
It did, and it turns out, one of the facets of this Joint Special Operations Command, these task forces, was that they had this really incredible high tempo of operations. Right. And that was because they had turned the sort of usual intelligence gathering equation on its head. Usually intelligence gathering informs operations. So you gather intelligence, use actionable intelligence to do operations. They had gotten into this cycle of operations. They called it F3E&A, find, fix, finish, exploit intelligence that you gather at these houses and analyze. And that got, the tempo of that was so industrial level that they every target that they fell in on gave them more targets. And it just kind of reached a virtuous cycle. And they were really getting inside the decision-making loop of al-Qaeda in a way that made their leaders very vulnerable.
Let's talk about, there's some news in the book. And it's not without controversy.
News, oh good.
It's not without controversy, but it's fascinating. In the book, you talk about veteran counterterrorist officials, namely General Flynn, who concluded in 2012 that the Obama administration was seeking to suppress intelligence on Islamic extremist threats in order to justify walking away from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and other countries that had fallen apart while he was president. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
Well, that's one of the central tensions that I talked about earlier. There is this feeling amongst, and Flynn was the chief intelligence officer for Joint Special Operations Command in Iraq and Afghanistan, so he was very close to the fight.
Flynn, whose name is up for several jobs in the next administration.
He's Donald Trump's senior national security advisor, alter ego, if you will. And he was at the Defense Intelligence Agency, and he was seeing intelligence about the growth of the threat from ISIS and other groups. A lot of it coming from Syria, but other places as well. He showed me a chart, 2004 to 2014. The number of Islamic extremist groups had actually doubled at a time when the narrative was, threats going away, we can go back to a new normal. And he saw that as that intelligence, went up the chain of command, it got diluted and diluted until, because he read the presidential daily brief, a lot of the threat warnings were being sort of diluted out of the intelligence assessment. Subsequently, we've now learned there was a Pentagon Inspector General investigation where 50 analysts from Central Command made the same complaint, that their rather alarmist intelligence analysis on the growth of ISIS somehow disappeared. Now, in that case, it was at the top levels of U.S. Central Command where they pointed the finger. So it's one of these things where, when a narrative is coming out of the White House, I'm not saying, and obviously Flynn's very upset about that. He thinks that's one of the reasons he didn't get to serve his third year at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Just did a profile on him for Politico magazine, if anyone wants the really in-depth story on that. But he felt very frustrated that what he thought was a growing threat was being basically perceived by the public as a dying threat and explained by the White House as sort of, we've won this. And that caused a lot of tension. And Flynn represents, that's not everyone in the intelligence community, but Flynn represented a core group who felt that the enemy was not dead, that the enemy is really this ideology that all these groups fly under this black banner, whether it's Al-Qaeda or ISIS or Taliban or Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, that they all are united by an ideology. They have connective tissue between them. They have personnel they share between them. And that the threat was growing, and he felt that the White House was not really explaining that threat to the public. He was very frustrated.
Why did he think that?
Well, like I said, because he was watching the intelligence stream, and the intelligence that he saw wasn't getting into the president's daily brief. And what was being, in the president's speeches, we're talking about basically this seminal counterterrorism speech in May of 2013 was basically describing Al-Qaeda's decimated, our troops are coming home, we can basically rely on this drone program and keep America safe, and that's the new normal. And he fought back against that. He didn't believe that.
And is he still fighting that fight to some extent?
He still believes that, and he's going to be a very senior person. So yeah, I suspect one of the things you'll see from a Trump administration is you won't talking about this threat as being bigger than just ISIS or Al-Qaeda. It's an ideology, and wherever it raises its head and forms a group that puts its black banner in territory, that we're probably going to be fighting that group sooner or later, because it's virulently anti-Western. It's virulently intolerant, not only of other religions, but also of different strains of Islam, like Shias. I mean, they massacre, ISIS likes to massacre Shias, just like its predecessor, Al-Qaeda in Iraq does. So, yeah, I think you'll see very much a different narrative coming out of the Trump White House. And
what will that narrative be, though, in terms of fighting counterterror?
I think that this is a, and I don't want to speak for Lieutenant General Mike Flynn. The narrative is going to be this war is not over. Quite honestly, if you see what President Obama has done in the last year, a year and a half ago he's talking about ISIS as the JV team of terrorism. He's not talking that way anymore. He's talking about 2 years ago about this war being over. He's now talking about a generational struggle. We have, if anyone was reluctant to put troops back in Iraq, it was President Obama, but he did it because he realized what a threat ISIS was. He has frozen the troop withdrawals from Afghanistan because Taliban's coming back. So I think there's a general consensus now. This conflict is generational. It's a different kind of conflict. It's not one that you can say, we can walk away from because we won. The enemy gets a vote, as you know, the military says that, and this enemy has decided to keep fighting.
Well, can you walk us through the transformation of the U.S. counterterrorism network and its operational style? I mean, the book talks about the partnerships.
Yeah. So those joint task forces, the Joint Special Operations Command, under very visionary leadership with Stanley McChrystal and then Bill McRaven, and now Scott Miller, who was former Delta Force commander. That ethos of breaking down the walls between intelligence, law enforcement, and the military, finding synergistic style of operations that merges all their talents into a synergistic skill set, that now has been expanded to our global counterterrorism network. If you go to the National Counterterrorism Center, which is right out here near Tyson's Corner, it's like the mother lode in this network that they've formed, and their mantra is it takes a network to defeat a network, and the enemy works in networks as well. So they've designed very flat organizations, and if you go to the major nodes like National Counterterrorism Center, which I went to, they have multi-agency inside the National Counterterrorism Center. They call them pursuit groups that look just like a JSOC task force. Mm-hmm. And if you go all over the country now, you'll see a lot of joint terrorism task forces that combine intelligence, law enforcement, and inside America, not military, but combine the intelligence and law enforcement community. That has become the norm now. We have a globe-spanning network of counterterrorism. We have, JSOCs back in Iraq, but the ones in Iraq can use the global there's a technological revolution at the bottom of this too, which is this global communication system that ties this network together, and where the frontline Delta Force team in Iraq right now in Erbil has hundreds of analysts scattered all over the world analyzing the drone surveillance from that are drones flown from Creech Air Force Base in Arizona, analyzed in Norfolk at what they call the Defense Common Ground System. And they call it remote split operations, but it's created a network that can turn its focus on a hard stare on any place on the earth within a matter of seconds. And that's something, as recently as Desert Storm, it took 3 days to do biome damage assessment. Now and it includes all the satellites and all the drones, but it's now tied into a network that looks very much like what Stan McChrystal and those guys created at JSOC, just expanded out. And then talking to the people of that network, all the people all from these agencies who, rotated through joint task forces of JSOC have now risen through the whole system, and they're working at the National Counterterrorism Center. They're working in all these different nodes, so there's this experience level now. These guys only know working together, and so that ethos kind of pumps through the entire global U.S. counterterrorism network. It's pretty amazing.
Well, tell us a little bit more about that. It's generally understood that before 9/11, the CIA and the FBI had considerable barriers between them, to say the least, and it hampered their cooperation. The atmosphere you describe now has really changed, and how has it changed, and how has the removal of barriers been a positive development?
Well, and you raised a really interesting point, because I've done those stories, and the FBI and the CIA on these joint task forces, counter-drug or whatever, used to joke that you had to check your guns at the door or else they'd shoot each other. Their cultures were so antagonistic to each other. The CIA with the Tweety Georgetown types, and the FBI, the beat cop kind of image. They were like oil and water. So when they started these joint task forces, they literally had their workstations sort of isolated by crime scene tape, so the other guys wouldn't come over there and look over their shoulder at what they're doing. The National Counterterrorism, they brought all these agencies together, and they would have like 15 different computer systems on their workstations because they were all stovepiped to their mother agency, not sharing it with each other. They had to, at these task forces, finally say, look, guys, you have to put all your sources on this blackboard so everyone knows each other's sources. And when they did that, and you had to make a promise, you can't poach each other's sources. And when they did that, realized that some of the same sources were being used by 2 or 3 or 4 agencies and telling them different things, contradictory things, depending on what they thought they wanted to hear, because they were getting paid. And so it went from there to a very desperate fight where they all finally said, to win this fight, we've got to work together. And that was a huge change, and it's now, like I said, percolated up throughout the entire system. So working together, and of course, the post 9/11 Commission report and all the reforms broke down, allowed a lot of that sharing that was previously from the church committees back in the 1970s. It wasn't even allowed. So our intelligence sharing now is just eons above where it was at 9/11. And one of the reasons I want to write the book is I think that's what good looks like, and I don't want us to lose that.
So now we've got Yale and Ohio State playing on the same field.
Exactly.
On the same team.
Exactly.
Got
Linemen, running backs, quarterback.
Got it, got it. Well, what did you discover as you peeled back some of these veils behind the terrorist targeting program?
Well, one of the things I discovered was a much more granular understanding of the enemy. I mean, one of the fascinating parts of the book is where, the FBI realized that, its job is to protect Americans, and Americans are being killed by these IED cells in Kabul. So Bryan Mcauley, who I profile in the book, who's the head of the internet, he was the legat in Kabul at the time.
Tell us who Brian Mcauley is. He's one of the unsung, unnamed, people, he's not a name, he's not a household name.
Yeah, he's an astounding special agent who got very early on, he's one of the visionary leaders who said, we can't afford to be fighting each other. We've got an enemy here we have to fight, so we need to work together. So he floods, there was only a handful of FBI guys in Afghanistan. He brings in more than 100 and goes after these IED cells that are killing American soldiers. And in trying to understand these IED cells, improvised explosive devices, for anyone who doesn't know what IED is, he brings in the behavioral science guys, the serial killer profilers from Quantico, and he has them interview failed suicide bombers. Either their vest didn't go off or they lost their nerve or whatever. And these really expert profilers interviewed these guys for weeks, and they understood how these guys were, most of them fairly low-level peasant guys in Pakistan and in the Afghan refugee camps who were radicalized by a radical imam in one of these madrasas or one of these radical mosques in the tribal areas of Pakistan, and basically just brought along to this all the way, told they're going to go to heaven if they do this operation. Their families are paid a certain amount of money. Then they were brought through these logistics lines all the way to Kabul with a handler, where they meet up with the guy in Kabul who makes the vest or the vehicle IED. So they understood, they got to understand the enemy at a real granular level, and understood that there was an ideological element to that enemy, but also understood that, as one of the profilers told me, they could feel this unseen hand manipulating these guys, and it was very sophisticated because they would, if it was someone who was uneducated and not particularly capable, they would send them after a soft target. But if they found someone who was more educated and more capable, they would put them into teams and do more hard target kind of commando team things, the kind of thing you saw in Paris and Brussels. So there was someone, as the profiler said to me, if I was picking a team to do this, I'd pick exactly these guys and assign them exactly the tasks that they were being given. So very sophisticated enemy who understands how to recruit, how to radicalize, and how to deploy these guys in a very expert manner.
Who to pick?
Like I said, they would pick peasant guys to do, they would do children, convince the 6-year-old to wear a suicide vest and told him he would spray flowers. So these are incredibly cynical and brutal people. But they would also pick more educated people, like bin Laden did with the crew that did 9/11. And if it saw these were highly educated guys, they could pull off a complex attack like 9/11, or guys not capable to do that, we'll just run him up into a police academy or something like that and have him blow himself up.
Why did you focus so much attention in the book on the U.S. interrogation program?
For a couple of reasons. I was in Iraq when Abu Ghraib broke, and saw how that upended our whole operation there. It totally, all the trust that American troops and leaders had built up with the Iraqis started to go out the window because of the humiliating treatment. Recruiting, an incredible recruiting poster for Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and they had the numbers to prove it. I mean, that's not an assumption, that's a fact. And I also was embarrassed as an American. And oh, by the way, I talked to the guys who did these who did the interrogations, and the enhanced interrogation techniques create a lot of corrupted intelligence, because if you're getting waterboarded 80 times, you're going to tell someone exactly what you think they want to hear, not what is necessarily the truth. So there was one case, and I have a whole chapter in it, where the first big al-Qaeda operative that was captured after 9/11, Abu Zubaydah, he was the only one who was actually used both techniques, because the FBI team got to him first and did a traditional weeks worth of interrogation where they had to win his confidence and break his story down and very patiently pull his story and break his story down until he gives up. And then the CIA came in and eventually did the enhanced interrogation techniques for more than 3 weeks in more than 80 waterboarding cases. And the CIA got nothing out of him. And the FBI got the fact that he gave up the fact that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was the mastermind of 9/11 and that Jose Padilla was an American al-Qaeda operative who wanted to do a dirty bomb attack. So to me, it was a perfect case, because I still see polls where Americans think not only that torture works, and apparently our new president thinks so too, but that it's okay, and I think it's wrong on both counts.
Well, the culture between the FBI and the CIA had a difference of opinion on that. Is that right?
Yeah, but and this was this interesting point, because one of the things that was so critical about the synergy that was created in these joint task forces was understanding what each agency brought to the table.
Sure.
And the FBI brings, these guys have been interviewing criminals and getting them to spill the beans. That's a core capability of the FBI. CIA doesn't interrogate anyone. They got these two Air Force psychologists to design, who themselves have never interrogated anyone, to design this enhanced interrogation protocol that was built on basically a program that we trained American troops how to resist what the communist regimes would do when they would capture you, like North Koreans. And so and that was a perfect example where they didn't understand who brought what to the table. You would never ask the CIA does brilliant stuff in terms of intelligence analysis, and that makes very clear in that, because when they were working together, the FBI guy would get a piece of information, and the FBI is not particularly well suited to track that information down. CIA would come back in a day and with all their analytical capability and say, oh, he's talking about this guy because we've looked at all the travel, et cetera, and that's how they got to Jose Padilla. So that was a perfect case where you have to understand who brings what to the table. CIA does not have a skill set where an integral skill set of interrogating people. It's just not something they do much of.
What have we learned collectively from interrogations of Islamist extremists?
Well, we learned that we learned their networks, for one. I mean, once they do, and they did break this guy down, and gotten great intelligence from a lot of the interrogations. The template they designed, I should say, the FBI, from interviewing these serial killer guys, interviewing the behavioral science guys, interviewing would-be suicide bombers, is they built a template of interrogation, understanding the motivations of an Islamic extremist who wants to kill himself, as long as he brings some Westerners with him, and use that as a template to interrogate or interview the would-be Times Square bomber, Faisal Shahzad, the would-be New York subway bomber, Najibullah, can't remember his last name. Sorry? Zazi. There he is, Zazi, exactly. So they use this template of what they've learned to sort of break these guys down in interrogations. And we learned that these guys have very sophisticated terrorist masters. We learned that they are very ideologically driven. And their ideology is virulently anti-Western, and it's Salafi jihadist ideology. It's kind of violent and intolerant by its very nature. So you get a sense not only of the enemy, but you get a sense of also his networks, because if they give up names, and you can start to make connections, and you can start to flesh out what their networks look like.
Do you think the new style of counterterrorism operations that you describe in the book will survive the end of the post-9/11 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan?
One of the reasons I wrote the book is because I think it needs to, and the signs aren't great, to be honest with you. We've gone into a post-war mindset in this country where we're gutting our military readiness with sequester. We are, what happened to Mike Flynn, he was asked by Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta to come back from war and to put a more wartime ethos in the Defense Intelligence Agency, and was not allowed to finish the job because he was too disruptive. And that's, to me, a bad sign. These guys coming back from the war were kind of amazed at how the country had moved on, and they feel like the conflict is still going. So I wrote recently in Yahoo News a case where Bryan Mcauley, you guys may have heard from this, got into controversy because the State Department called him up about a Hillary Clinton email and asked could it be declassified, and he found out it was about Benghazi and said, no, but I need you to put my FBI guys back in the Baghdad embassy. So the Congress basically has launched a criminal investigation of that, is pressuring the Justice Department. That's exactly the kinds of crosstalk you want your agencies to be doing. I mean, that is standard operating procedure. If you start criminalizing an interagency crosstalk, you will ruin this model. You know, a lot of the post-Snowden reforms are, you know, we didn't talk about the NSA, but a lot of what the NSA did that Snowden revealed was things that also were techniques developed in Iraq at the height of the war there, real-time regional gateway, really sophisticated geolocation capabilities, really sophisticated algorithms to query telephone metadata. They're worried, they're saying that their threat radars are going dark between that and because of encryption. You know, if we are going to, as a society, allow companies to make phones that even with a warrant you can't break into, this model is going to be less effective. There's no question about that.
Let's go to some of your questions. My colleagues can pass a microphone around, I believe. Do we have a microphone? Questions? Don't be shy. I know you got questions here.
I couldn't possibly have explained all that.
Yes, sir, right here. Oh, I'm sorry.
And there's one over here after you.
Thank you. Really thank you for the talk and giving.
Can you tell us who you are?
I'm Tunir. I'm graduate CSIS. I work with the AMTI department.
Great.
So, I mean, of course, so much specialization has been spent into counterterrorism policy since 9/11, but when I look at counterterrorism, it's like a very micro political impact, case-to-case basis on countries. So when one needs to deal with the entire perspective that's out there of how to deal with terrorism in a way of tackling it in everyday society, given what has happened in Paris and Brussels recently, what can you, like being a reporter in this field, what do you think the mindset of the common man on the streets rather than like specialists who study this field?
Good question. For one thing, I think that what Paris and Brussels revealed is that this intense intelligence sharing and cooperation that we do, it does not characterize the European intelligence model. So they don't talk to each other like our agencies do. And so you have a very big problem where a terrorist comes in through Greece or Turkey and then goes through Germany or then into Brussels and then down to France. He's crossing many international borders and agencies that don't talk very well with each other. That's a gaping vulnerability that has to be, because all these, most European citizens don't have to get visas to come to this country. So Europe Europe needs to learn from this model themselves and really get over their competition between their intelligence agencies. That's number one. I think we also learned that you have to address radicalization to some degree. You recently saw the United Kingdom arrest this hate preacher. I'm a journalist. I live and die by free speech, but there's always a limit on free speech and inciting violence. And there's a whole chapter in the book about Carlos Bledsoe, who was an African-American kid from a middle-class family in Tennessee. He became the first jihadist to launch a terrorist attack, a lethal terrorist attack inside the United States after 9/11. And his case was so typical. He got in trouble with the law. He was in a kind of a place where he was troubled, and reached out. His uncle was a Muslim for Farrakhan's group, and so he went to a mosque that happened to have a Salafi fundamentalist preacher who hooked him in and then sent him to Yemen for jihadist finishing school. Got arrested in Yemen, spent time in prison. A lot of these guys spend sort of their masters in jihadism is in prisons where they're put in their, it's a perfect breeding ground for terrorism. That includes Zawahiri, who leads Al-Qaeda. It includes Zarqawi, who led Al-Qaeda in Iraq, spent time in a Jordan prison. Al-Baghdadi, ISIS guy, we had him in our prison in Bucca. So he just touched all those things, and you could see this process of radicalization that if you don't pay attention to it, then the next wave of jihadists is being created even as we sit here and talk.
We had a question back there.
Yes, ma'am.
Lady in the purple.
Hi, my name is Shohini. I'm not with CSIS. I had a question. I haven't read your book, so I don't know if you have...
It's just out. You have a good excuse.
Yes, so I don't know, you may have already addressed it, but there's something I've always been curious about the nature of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. It has been discussed a lot that Al-Qaeda was much more difficult to penetrate with humans because of relationships and networks. In ISIS, you have this humongous influx of foreign fighters and just like kids just going up there to like play a video game. So do you think that ISIS is better penetrated by humans than Al-Qaeda, given the opportunity to, because it feels like it's easier, it would be easier to penetrate than it was to penetrate Al-Qaeda? And if that penetration has happened, do you anticipate the results of that human culminating in some time in near future?
That's a good point. Al-Qaeda was harder to penetrate because they were much more careful about their vetting. Baghdadi was kind of like open up the gates, come to the caliphate, and 35,000 foreign fighters answered that call. There's pros and cons to each side. Al-Qaeda had a lot longer to develop. It had almost a decade with very little harassment from us or anyone else. So it could afford to be a little more careful. ISIS developed very quickly and decided to be very ambitious very, very early on. So they are more open to infiltration. Have we infiltrated ISIS? I honestly don't know the answer to that. I would say that it certainly hasn't been perfect infiltration because we've been surprised, really ugly surprises, like Charlie Hebdo, like the Paris attack, like the Brussels attack. What we're finding is, rather than being the JV team of terrorism, ISIS is real, to me, like Al-Qaeda 3.0. It learned, and these are learning organizations, and they're related, and the people share lessons from fighting us for over a decade. And they learned from Al-Qaeda core, Osama bin Laden, how the strategy of attacking the West brings you sort of the coin of the realm in the terrorist pantheon, which is money, prestige, recruits. They learned from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula's Anwar al-Awlaki's group, very sophisticated at social media, very sophisticated at recruitment, inspiring lone wolves from long distances. Online, both of them have online magazines, Inspire and Dubiq in the terms of ISIS. And they learned from Al-Qaeda in Iraq just their wanton brutality and how for a certain mindset that plays well. Of all the terrorist groups, Al-Qaeda in Iraq was by far the most brutally willing to massacre civilians. They've massacred tens of thousands of Iraqis, most of them Shia. ISIS does the same thing. We've seen its brutality. It's taken it to a whole new level. So I think ISIS is kind of Al-Qaeda 3.0, and now we have to worry about what 4.0 is going to look like once they lose their territory. So long answer to your question. I'm not sure if we've infiltrated it. I know we haven't. I know our intelligence on it is not nearly where it should be because we've been surprised too many times by them. Yes?
Question right here.
Oh,
sir.
sorry.
Here, we'll go.
Thanks. I'm Steve Hirsch. I'm a journalist, and I worked with James at the National Journal Group about
recognize
1,000
Steve.
years ago.
Good to see you.
And I also haven't read your book yet. But let me ask you two somewhat related questions. One is, in this book, do you cover cooperation between the United States and all of the other major allies and how it's worked out? And the related question is, now that Trump has been the president-elect for almost 48 hours. Do you have any thoughts on how this was going to change in the Trump administration?
The joint task forces that were in Iraq and Afghanistan included coalition partners. So, as a matter of fact, Mike Flynn was investigated from the Inspector General's office because he was sharing intelligence with British commanders who had American units in there, which was kind of ridiculous, who had American units underneath them in regions of Afghanistan. So, to that extent, I covered that cooperation. In terms of going deep into our intelligence sharing cooperation between our intelligence agencies and European or other ones, I mean, there's the Five Eyes, New Zealand, Australia, Britain, ourselves.
Canada.
There is very close cooperation there, but it falls off very quickly after that. And we saw that with the whole, how the Germans were surprised so much by what went on with Snowden. I'm sorry, and your second question was, Trump. Well, I mean, Mike Flynn is Trump's national security alter ego, and I've interviewed him many times and know him pretty well. He views this as a connected fight. His words to me were, everyone kept talking about we've decimated core Al-Qaeda. To me, the core is the ideology, and I think he's onto something. All these groups, and people talk about, the competition between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but there's hardly any difference in their worldview or the ideology that drives them. And so, a lot of counterterrorism people are very afraid of an eventual, once Zawahiri is out of the way, of an eventual merging of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which could still happen, because or Taliban, or Al-Shabaab, or, I mean, a lot of the affiliates that, became ISIS affiliates were former Al-Qaeda affiliates, but ISIS was the brand of the day. So I think it's not helpful to think of these groups as distinguished small groups that, once you defeat that group, the problem's gone. It's this pantheon of like-minded groups that share intelligence, share lessons learned, and share a common ideology. And I think you'll see, Trump, that'll be part of his secret plan, is to view it that way, because I know that's how Mike Flynn thinks.
Question over here, Max.
Hey, Max, I work here in the building. Question about the Trump administration. What are the most critical counterterrorism positions that Donald Trump is going to be filling? And do you have any thoughts on who might be filling those positions?
I don't. I've been trying to, I've been asked to figure this out by a media outlet. I'm trying to, I don't think they know themselves, quite honestly. So it's not, everyone likes to speculate. It's the best game in town. I think that, the key positions for counterterrorism are the White House counterterrorism chief, Lisa Monaco now, for that, Fran Townsend. This person's Clark.
Brennan.
This person is the president's go-to person on terrorism, so that's a key position. I think the head of the National Counterterrorism Center is also key. The head of the Defense, DNI, the Defense, the
Director of National Intelligence.
Director of National Intelligence, thank you, is key because he has to keep focus on the big intelligence picture, but also has to stay focused on the terrorism threat. And I think Clapper's been actually very good at that. So those are the big ones, I think, for terrorism. And of course, the military positions. The military, so much is around Joint Special Operations Command. That is our direct action military counterterrorism group. So those positions are always key. They're military guys. They're 3-star generals. But those positions are key. I think that's less of a problem picking that, because the military will kind of signal who the people are who fill that position. But those are the big ones. And I would just be guessing if I said I had any idea who he will pick on that. Yes, ma'am. And then this gentleman. I think she was first, and then this gentleman.
Hi, my name is Sarah Thompson. I'm at the State Department. I just had a quick question, jumping off of the previous question about the characterization of this conflict, in the sense of, if it's ideological, is it dangerous to refer to it as a war and the terminology surrounding that, the connotations that come from that? And would you then characterize it by some other terminology or address it as just a conflict? And 'cause I think that the terminology definitely then shapes the mentality of what you're going into, which then affects the entire approach. So I'm sorry, I guess it's not a really clear question, but what are your thoughts on that?
No,
And
I know that
there
issue
should be a
very
change
well.
of how we approach it. Thank you.
You know, the Bush administration didn't say much about Islamic extreme terrorism either. They also understood that there's a negative thing that goes along with calling it that. And the Obama administration has been very reluctant to say that because it doesn't want to tar the wider Muslim community, 99-point-something% of which are peaceful people, with this group. As a journalist, though, I mean, you can't deny. I don't think you can deny there's an ideological component to this. There's a component to this, and as a journalist, I try to be as clear as I can. So I think there's something about naming your enemy and understanding that because it leads to faulty thinking. For instance, if you think it's just another terrorist group, then when you destroy that terrorist group, then the problem over, right? So when Al-Qaeda's decimated, problem over, right? Well, the problem's not over because the ideology is growing. It's because it grows in certain kinds of conditions, and those conditions after the Arab Spring were all over the place, and it doubled in size. So I think I'm sympathetic to the president not wanting to say that, and I'm fine with just journalists and other people talking about the exact nature of it. And I was very disturbed when Donald Trump started saying, ban all Muslims. That's exactly the kind of reason why the president didn't want to say, because some demagogue would pick up on that and tar the whole religion, which is super unhelpful, because that feeds right into the enemy's narrative of a war against Islam in the West. So it's a ticklish thing, but as a journalist, I think we need to understand the nature of the enemy, and it does have an ideology. And I would hope we could be sophisticated enough to understand that, and maybe we can't in our politics. So I go back and forth on this, but there is something important about understanding the nature of the enemy and calling it what it is. But it can be, if you take it too far, it can be very unhelpful. So we as Americans have just got to be a little more sophisticated about how we talk about this, I think. And diplomacy is, you guys are in the front lines of that. So I understand why the State Department might be very reticent to get into that kind of description. Whereas if I'm sitting in the Pentagon and we're talking about this threat, I want to hear understanding of the threat, specifically the enemy we confront. Because like I said, if you're not specific, it can lead you down some bad assumptions like, these are discrete groups that once you defeat them, they're defeated. That's not what these are. They're part of a wider movement.
Next Tuesday, on November 15th, CSIS will be releasing our Commission on Countering Violent Extremism report. This is a commission that we convened here. It's chaired by former British Prime Minister Tony Blair and former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta. So look for that. It addresses a lot of your questions and addresses the language, addresses the root causes, it addresses really what it is a template. It was designed as a template. We've been working on it for over a year for the next administration to look at in terms of what are they going to do to counter violent extremism. And so, of course, we're going to be presenting it to the next administration and the next generation of leaders in Europe as well.
Yes, sir, I promise you to.
My name is Samar Chatterjee, Safe Foundation. I just want to go a little further than what she asked in my question. You talk about radicalization, you talk about ideology. Now, United States has been occupying both Iraq and Afghanistan almost 15 to 16 years. And, I was born in India, and we know how we fought the British, and they occupied the country for almost 100 years. And we had people who were doing the same thing what the Al-Qaeda is doing and ISIS is doing. And we had people like Gandhi who was kind of trying to work with the enemy hand in hand trying to paralyze them by peaceful methods, and as well as working with them in the government and trying to stab them wherever you can, so that you could throw them out. So those Afghans and those Iraqis who are in these countries, they consider American presence for all this period as a foreign intervention. Foreigners must leave, and let us fight it among ourselves, whether Al-Qaeda wins or the average citizens or the Prime Minister wins. Who is the winner and who is going to rule the country?
Right.
So given that, aren't we, when we put these things like, if the Russians were occupying this country for 15 years and dividing each other, fighting each other, we would be doing the same thing what ISIS is doing or Al-Qaeda is doing.
Do we have a question?
So what's wrong with it? We've got to figure out a way to get out.
Yeah,
and
no.
Then hope all these, both radicalization and ideology, would change.
I take your point. As long as we're a foreign occupying force in a foreign land, especially a Muslim land, there'll be even a nationalist outbreak against us for that. And point well taken. However, I would also point out, we didn't occupy Afghanistan in the 1990s when it was given Al-Qaeda bases to train people to come and kill Americans. They attacked our embassies, and they attacked. That's true, but we did not occupy Afghanistan, and the Taliban because of. Sorry.
You aided them against the Russians.
Right. But we did not. I'm going to your point about occupation. We can go back into the long history of American policy, which we don't have time for. But on the terms of occupation, we tried. In Afghanistan, the Taliban, let Al-Qaeda build bases to attack the West, and they attacked us numerous times, culminating in 9/11. Taliban's making a comeback in Afghanistan. If we have any doubt, they'll do the exact same thing if we don't keep the Taliban from gaining power. It was destroyed last year when the biggest Al-Qaeda base we've seen since 9/11 was found in Kandahar. So, there's no easy answers to this. I don't think occupying a bunch of countries is the answer. But I think that the answer is not to sort of ignore these issues. We tried to ignore ISIS until it basically took over Iraq and Syria and started launching attacks in Paris and Brussels. So, I don't think occupation is the answer, but I don't think ignoring the problem solves it either, because we've tried that, and the problem still persists.
Hi there. My name is Josh. First of all, thank you very much for this talk. It's been very interesting. I work as a threat intelligence analyst for one of the Canadian banks. I was hoping that you could comment on the role of Twilight soldiers in the Mosul operation.
In the what? I'm sorry?
In the operation in Mosul, Iraq.
Oh, well, I've written about I was over there a month ago with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We are using the template you're seeing to your question about occupation. Very light footprint now in Afghanistan, in Iraq, very, very small in Syria. The template now is to use really the skill set of this, what I've talked about in this discussion and in the book, the Joint Special Operations Command developed, and to marry it to proxy forces on the ground who are fighting for their own country and their own land. So we are bringing the things that the network does best, which is advanced intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, special forces strike teams, which have killed more than 120 ISIS leaders in the last year and a half, 2 years, train and assist, command and control, and marrying it to Kurdish Peshmerga forces, to Iraqi security forces, to Syrian Kurdish forces in Syria. We're doing the same thing in Somalia, bringing all those skill sets to the African Union Force that's trying to stabilize Somalia. That's the new template, not occupation, but to find partners who we can support, who themselves want to fight this. There aren't that many people in the world who really want to live in a 7th century, fundamentalist Islamist society anymore. So there are willing partners out there, but we have to be willing to help them. But we've learned this skill set that's very useful to empowering proxy forces on the ground, and I think that's what you're seeing in Mosul. It's what you're going to see in Raqqa soon, and it's pretty powerful. Takes time because if we had American troops, you could do it a lot quicker. But as we said, there's a big downside to having a big American footprint, and we've learned that too. So,
We have time for one more question.
sir.
Thanks very much. My name is Steve Greta. I'm with Insight Consulting. My question is about cost of military operations. I know it's an issue related to rising national debt and everything, and I just wonder if you think that this new model or this Twilight Warrior can be a more cost-effective means of exerting U.S. force around the world, and if so, how?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think it's not cheap, but it's a lot cheaper than large ground forces, occupying forces. It's a lot less blowback locally. I don't think it reminds me, this kind of, because of its ideological dimension, it reminds me kind of the Cold War, where we had lots of little things going on that were, none of them were put inside Vietnam or the Iraq War. There was kind of discrete operations that were going on. I think you have to weigh the cost of doing that against the cost of not doing it. And we've seen the cost of not doing it. I mean, I still remember 9/11. I suppose everyone else in this room does too. The cost of letting these groups get powerful and to plot and to train, we know what happens there. It's not a theoretical problem anymore. We know. Paris knows, Nice knows, New York knows, Washington knows. We know what will happen if these groups are uncontested. So you have to weigh the cost of doing this kind of operations on a pretty continual basis against not doing it and letting these groups, and I would argue that's even more costly. And quite honestly, we're not spending anything in terms of defense right now. We're spending less than the Cold War average in terms of GDP, which has grown. So, but in terms of GDP, this is not a burden that we can't bear. I would argue that the burden we can't bear as societies, as we've seen with how what's happened in Europe has changed the political dynamic there in a very worrisome way. There are huge costs in not confronting these threats too.